My mother, who was the travel agent for guilt trips, could write a pretty mean letter when she was in the mood to do it. The worst one I ever received came after they had visited me in the church where I worked in Louisville, Kentucky. Several of us went out after church, after the service, and I bought my dad a beer to go with our tacos. My mother, I'm certain, came to America on the Mayflower in the company of some hard-ass Puritans. For her, drinking a beer was exactly the same as trying to drink all of the beer. There was no line between occasional or moderate alcohol and full-blown alcoholism. She wrote a letter to me that was so toxic the postman delivered it holding tongs. In fact, a year after my mother had died, my father told me that he had bought a six-pack of beer and put it in the refrigerator, but every time he opened the refrigerator door, he said he could hear Helen crying behind him. So he eventually just gave up and threw it away. Needless to say then, I grew up in a home that was so dry it was a fire hazard. My first encounter with an alcoholic was in my student church in Russellville, Kentucky. My attempts to help that man led me to attending AA meetings with him and eventually doing my master's thesis in the treatment of alcoholism. During my doctoral work, I took my clinical pastoral education working as a chaplain in the Veterans Hospital's Addiction Treatment Center in Nashville, Tennessee. I became a huge fan of the 12-step recovery program, which, almost like my mother, had written the literature teaching that the cure for addiction was to embrace a life of absolute abstinence. In that understanding of addiction, there may have been some people who weren't addicts, who could drink or not drink, but then there were alcoholics, whom we protected in the treatment center from even having access to mouthwash that had alcohol in it, or even some of the tabletop cleansers. And I still don't want to throw any shade on the AA program. It has worked for more people than any other treatment program in a century, and that is admirable. But over my years of work with both drug and alcohol addiction, I've realized that this binary view about addiction is totally nuts. There are people who drink to the point of intoxication every day, but they don't have blackouts, they don't have hangovers, they never miss work. But to say that they're not alcoholics misses the point. They're still emotionally unavailable as parents, they suck as partners, and they are chemically dependent. If you suggest to them to go a month, go 6 weeks without drinking, they will literally panic. Now, I want to talk about substance abuse and chemical abuse today, in large part because most of the whole world is confined to their homes, and they are faced with domestic tension, and the ones that don't have someone to fight with are dealing with boredom, and they have complicated feelings of anxiety and depression. Literally a powder keg for addiction and abuse issues. Bruce Alexander has written about the fact that historically speaking, cultures can go for generations with fairly low levels of substance abuse, and then circumstances change, and it becomes nearly universal. Honestly, I worry about that now during our months of quarantine. We've had about 10% of American society that could easily be defined as abusing drugs or alcohol. But under these circumstances, given the increased anxiety and the order to stay at home, well, I'm not the only one that's been at Walmart behind the guy who had a grocery cart full of bottles of liquor. There are people who are planning ahead to stay pickled until it's safe to go out again. And right now, AA meetings are not happening in person. There are some online options and things like that, but people that are used to meeting with a sponsor or used to going to meetings 3, 4, 5 times a week to maintain their sobriety are now having to rely on phone calls or video conferencing, and even those of us who are now having to experience church as a online video experience, we know it really isn't quite the same. Moderate drinkers under these circumstances can become full-blown alcoholics. And those who use Xanax or other panic and anxiety medications can begin to abuse their prescription drugs. And again, times like this, people that are still taking Adderall and other things for ADD, you can abuse those drugs very quickly. As I've commented before, chemically, they're the same thing as methamphetamine. And there'll be pharmaceutical reps and some physicians who will tell you that it's not true. Trust me, I'm a doctor, it's true. And my friend Paul Thomlinson will speak some more about the clinical research aspects of this. But you have to know, there are people whose lives are improved by being able to take these medications. But you take them too much, and yeah, you're a meth head. Now, after leaving my parents' home, alcohol became a part of my life. In college, it was typically an occasional pizza and beer. In grad school, I fell into the habit of either having wine or beer before going to bed to help me go to sleep for those precious 3 or 4 hours that a grad student gets to sleep. After graduation, though, it became part of social life. You got a beer with your friends after a run, after a tennis match, or a whitewater rafting event. As I got older, and when I became an empty nester, I started going out to hear live music with my friends, which almost always happens in a bar, and lo and behold, they all serve alcohol. Now, I never drank alcoholically. I never had a blackout. I've never had a DUI. I've never even had a hangover or a headache. But my doctor kept responding to my frustration about my inability to lose weight, especially as I've been threatened with high cholesterol and type 2 diabetes. He keeps suggesting that I cut alcohol out of my diet. He's a skinny little young guy, and it's hard to take him seriously when he gives advice like that. But to placate him, I would occasionally cut back, but never quite stop, until about 6 weeks ago. I'll tell you honestly, folks, I was getting really tired of salads, lots and lots of salads, and not losing weight. Realizing that my health demanded some serious action, I just stopped drinking. And I stopped before the whole COVID-19 thing was a big deal and restaurants and bars were closed. And I immediately started losing weight faster than I ever had before. Ironically, I also found that going to sleep was simply a matter of turning off the lights and going to bed. And when the world was still going out to bars to hear bands, I found that I could go out and drink water or diet soda, and that the people around me were not necessarily offended by that choice. I did, however, as a guy drinking a lot of iced tea and diet soda, start to notice how alcohol was affecting the people that I was hanging out with, and did not especially like what I saw. In fact, I feared that I may have permanently fractured an important friendship by simply being sober in the presence of someone who was plastered. And about a month ago, I donated blood and saw the lab test, and for the first time in 20 years, my cholesterol was normal. My blood sugar is down, my blue jeans are 3 sizes smaller. So I haven't sworn off alcohol forever. Remember, my mother is deceased, so I don't have anyone to be immediately accountable to. I'll have a drink if I want to, but realizing what my instincts might have led me to do when I was trapped at home day after day and month after month with a whole liquor cabinet full of tasty anesthesia, one could make a mistake very easily. So I just choose not to drink at all. I've known for years that alcohol can be dangerous because of alcoholism, but it's not just cirrhosis of the liver or drunk driving. That's not the only ways that alcohol can kill you. There's also diabetes, there's heart disease, there's obesity, and what I might call episodic insanity There is a special kind of COVID-19 crazy that's going on right now as people have all of their emotions tuned up to high drama, and you add alcohol to that, and you're likely to say some things that you can never unsay. I've always loved that famous Ben Franklin quote that beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. But like so many popular Ben Franklin quotes, he never said it, and he evidently didn't like beer. However, rather more poetically, he made a similar sentiment known in a letter to a friend. He wrote, "Behold the rain which descends from heaven upon our vineyards and which incorporates itself with grapes to be changed into wine, a constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy." But as Franklin, during his years as the American diplomat in France, became known for giving up state secrets to any prostitute with a bottle of wine, spirits can gladden your heart and lubricate social settings, but drinking doesn't make you smarter, and it reduces your inhibitions, and probably reduces them below the level of good, rational, well-informed decision-making. Again, I'm not saying that I'm going to take up my mother's mantle. I will have a drink from time to time, but not very often, and probably not at all during the COVID-19 quarantine, because it's just too easy to fall into the habit of coping through self-medication. And folks, that's got to go for Xanax and Adderall and all of their derivative drugs as well. Just because you have a prescription for it doesn't mean you should take it all the time. Now, allow me to remind you, I am a doctor, maybe not the kind that should be talking about this, but I am. I have all the sheepskin under glass that I need to prove it. But I want to give you a prescription for especially in these days. I prescribe long walks in the sunshine. I prescribe meditation, reading, hot baths, conversation, exposure to art and to nature. And we're going to get through this. This isn't going to last forever. I just want all of you to emerge on the other side of quarantine healthier than when COVID-19 showed up in our neighborhoods.
Hello, everyone. So, everything you know or thought you knew about addiction is wrong? Well, that may be a tad hyperbolic. So let's say not everything and not for everyone, and maybe not so much wrong as incomplete. In using that title that Roger and I chose, it's similar to Johann Hari's TED Talk. We recognize and affirm the lived experience of those who struggled with addictions and alcoholism. And we recognize that the lived experience of some may differ and be contradictory to what we're sharing today. We don't seek to condescend to anyone in our remarks. But I can pretty much guarantee you that what we're saying today, the perspectives and evidence differ greatly from what most people in our culture have been taught and what they have believed or known about addictions. By the way, alcoholism is sort of our tracer condition today. It's our example of the day, but pretty much everything we're saying applies as well to all substances of addiction and abuse. I also want to begin with an assertion that I believe we need to be clear-eyed and honest and unafraid of the truth about human beings and our seemingly universal impulse to alter our state of consciousness. You want evidence of this? The historical and anthropological record are very clear. Humans have always consumed substances for the express purpose of altering consciousness and have found value in doing so. There seems to be a drive in us to experiment with ways of changing how we feel. Witness every child ever spinning in circles until they're dizzy as evidence of that drive and how much we seem to enjoy it from the beginning. And witness those same children falling on the hard concrete and breaking out their tooth as evidence of how much negative consequences can accrue to us as a result of altering our headspace too much. This brings me to another point. Yes, I'm still warming up. Our ambivalence about substances like alcohol. Most of us feel at least two ways at the very same time about it. I earned my PhD at Southern Miss in their APA-accredited psych program, where I took my very first course in addictions. That's where I heard my favorite and best illustration of this ambivalence we have. I lost it for years, couldn't find it anywhere, but finally found it for this talk through the magic of Google, going down lots of blind alleys. Judge Noah Soggy was his nickname, Sweat, gave his so-called whiskey speech as a state representative on the floor of the Mississippi State Legislature in 1952, when the prohibition of alcoholic liquor was still in effect in that state. And it goes like this, and I have to do this almost in its entirety, but it's very brief. And I can't stop myself from doing a Southern accent, so forgive me. I want you to know I do not shun controversy. On the contrary, I will take a stand on any issue at any time, regardless of how fraught with controversy it is. You've asked me how I feel about whiskey. All right, this is how I feel about whiskey. If when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, destroys the home, creates misery and poverty, yea, literally, taking the bread from the mouths of little children. If you mean the evil drink that topples the Christian man and woman from the pinnacle of righteous, gracious living to the bottomless pit of degradation and despair, shame and helplessness and hopelessness, then certainly I am against it. But if when you say whiskey, you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the ale that is consumed when good fellows gather together, puts a song in their hearts and laughter in their lips, and the warm glow of contentment in their eyes. If you mean Christmas cheer, if you mean the stimulating drink that puts the spring in old gentleman's step on a frosty, crispy morning, if you mean the drink which enables a man to magnify his joy and his happiness and to forget, even for a little while, his life's great tragedies, heartaches, and sorrows, if you mean that drink, the sale of which pours into our treasuries untold millions of dollars, which are used to provide tender care for our little crippled children, our blind, our deaf, our dumb, our pitiful, aged, and infirm, to build highways and hospitals and schools, then certainly I am for it. This is my stand. I will not retreat from it. I will not compromise. So, are you convinced that we as a culture are still at least as ambivalent about whiskey and a host of other mind-altering substances today, nearly 70 years later? I am. As Roger shared, a binary view of alcoholism has never been widely accepted scientifically speaking, and yet it has prevailed in the treatment world and in the popular culture for generations to this day. So what have we learned in the intervening years? What's worth sharing? What's worth knowing about some new ways of thinking about addiction? We all know that there's been a concerted effort going back at least to the 1930s to assert that substance use is a crime, primarily, and it deserves the most severe punishment, an idea rooted in the very limited view of addiction, one that makes it primarily about stigmatizing those with addictions as morally flawed and weak people. If you've ever known someone struggling mightily against addiction, you know they are neither. But that prevailing view made its way into the so-called public health campaigns of the 80s and 90s. Just say no. This is your brain on drugs, ad infinitum, ad nauseum. The underlying assumption here is that there are chemical hooks in the substances of abuse, and if you have the moral failing of trying them just one time, you'll be hooked, and well, you deserve everything that comes to you as a result. But if the chemical hooks hypothesis is correct, then shouldn't everyone who's had nicotine patches or Nicorette gum be able to quit smoking cigarettes as a delivery system for their nicotine, which is primarily what they are, right? We know that that marvelous product that's been developed can actually maintain the levels of nicotine in the bloodstream very easily at the same levels produced by heavy smoking. And yet, the quit rates for smoking, even with nicotine replacement, are abysmal. So there must be other explanations for why people continue to consume substances that are dangerous and even deadly. Well, those war on drugs propaganda messages in the 80s included one public service announcement based on studies from the 1960s showing rats in a cage dying from consuming heroin. You see, in those studies, scientists put a rat into a cage with 2 water bottles. One bottle had just pure water. The other had water laced with either cocaine or heroin. In virtually every case, in that free choice situation, as we say in laboratory science, ad libitum, free to drink as much as they want. Free choice situation, those rats would keep on drinking that drug-laced water until they died. Almost exclusively. Most of them died by overdose. So the conclusion is clear, right? Drugs are addictive and they will kill you. So that becomes the basis of this whole campaign. Well, kind of ironically, those messages and the underlying studies became an inspiration for a clever psychology researcher named Dr. Bruce Alexander, who we've heard from already this morning, at Simon Fraser University. This clever psychologist wondered, what else is going on here? Maybe it's not the drugs themselves that really explain what's happening. He wondered if it might be the cage, the environment in which these rats were placed, a bleak and solitary existence in which the only things they had to do was drink water or take drugs. So Alexander repeated the experiments brilliantly. But rather than putting one rat in a small cage with 2 bottles, he created what he called Rat Park. Famously now, this cage was filled with lots of good things to eat, other rats for socialization and plenty of sex and toys and colored balls for recreation. Rat Park also had 2 water bottles, water and 1 drugged water. The rats tried both, but given the free choice ad libitum situation, given the choice between good food, sex, playful friends, etc., none of the rats became addicted. Not a single one of them overdosed and died. Not one. In fact, they didn't even like the drugged water, given the alternatives. So, that's rats in cages, right? Does this have any relevance for human beings? Of course it does. Pesky research ethics prevent us from putting humans in cages for extended periods of time with ad libitum drug consumption, although I tried it and they just wouldn't let me. But as Johann Hari beautifully describes in his book, Chasing the Scream, in the Vietnam and its aftermath, we have something of a natural human experiment that illustrates these principles very, very well. At one point, a huge number, upwards of 10% of GIs in that jungle in Vietnam were doing heroin regularly. We all know there's a tolerance point. We develop a tolerance to heroin. It is an addictive substance, obviously. It causes many deaths. We're in the midst of still an opioid crisis, etc. There were a whole bunch of soldiers doing heroin, mainlining heroin in the jungle, a lot. Many, many thousands. It was feared at the time that when those soldiers came home, we would have hordes of vacant-eyed addicts roaming the streets. But that's not what happened, thankfully. When they were removed from their virtual rat cage in the jungles of Vietnam, they were able to come home to the embrace of family, the meaningful activities of employment and school. Most of them simply were no longer interested in heroin, and they quit. Most of them. Not to say some of them didn't come home with drug problems that needed help, and some of them destroyed their lives, but the vast majority of people just quit. They didn't come home and continue to work at the insurance agency and meet the dealer on the corner and get smacked at mainline. They quit. That's the lesson, right? They were not criminal. They were not physically addicted. They just changed their cages. As the great Hungarian-born Canadian physician, Dr. Gabor Mate, has put it, and I'll never forget hearing him say this the first time, all substances of abuse will either treat pain or distract from pain. So the question is not why the addiction. The question is why the pain. The question is a haunting one. It's one that we have to answer if we want to ever make long-term sustainable recovery possible for our brothers and sisters who are addicted. The source of the pain that humans treat with whiskey and OxyContin, with cocaine and benzodiazepines, are many. Chronic physical pain from injuries and illness, for sure, but I'm convinced it's much more likely to include psychic pain from trauma, either in childhood or later, from interpersonal alienation from primary nurturing relationships, from family disconnection, from shame and guilt heaped on us by heavy-handed religion, from abject loneliness, from having not found and connected to a guiding passion or a meaningful purpose for one's life. Those are the real sources of pain that lead people, so many, to find connection with alcohol or other drugs. These are the sources of pain that lead to self-medication. Where Aaron and I play and where our friends gather to hear us play at Shuffle, there's a t-shirt that says, "I have mixed drinks about feelings," which is funny, but it's also emblematic of a self-medication problem, perhaps. Those are the sources of pain that we have to find ways and means of treating. I'll conclude with an all too obvious application of all this to our current circumstances with the COVID-19 crisis. Under quarantine, we may all begin to feel a little bit like rats in cages, right? What if our cage is feeling pretty desolate and we have 2 bottles from which to choose? Got that healthy bottle of water in the fridge and we have a bottle of whiskey sitting on the bar. We might begin to choose the whiskey bottle or the bottle of pills rather than the healthy water bottle if we don't take care to enrich our environment. Rat Park was an enriched environment that included, not insignificantly, other rats with whom to play, socialize, have sex, be close to. So we need to enrich our environments by bringing our offline supports online through regular phone calls, FaceTime, Zoom. You know, you can even sync up your Netflix accounts with people now and have watching parties at a distance. Getting and or staying connected with others is really the most important thing we can do for ourselves right now. We need to enrich our environments by refusing to drink from the fire hose and restricting the flow of bad news and misinformation to make sure we're getting good information and also to balance it with stories of human kindness and resilience, because there's a whole bunch of those out there going on right now too. We need to enrich our environments by developing and demonstrating mastery. Learn something new or practice something old. To be most helpful and hopeful, I believe, make sure that you're mastering something that adds meaning and purpose to your life. Some way of adding beauty to your own environment, your own life, and those of others. Some way of contributing joy to someone who may desperately need your light. So let's all enrich our cages we're living in together.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.